Alex, would you like to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. The September 18th meeting is called to order at 8:30 a.m. Members of the public are welcome to address the board on subjects both on and off the agenda. Do we have any members of the public wishing to make comments?
We do not.
Judy, would you please do the roll call?
Yes. Mr. Kelly? Ms. Cavanis?
Here.
Mr. Jurdy?
Here.
Mr. Cromer?
Here.
Mr. Shoemaker? Ms. Harris is absent. Mr. Swope? Ms. Pierce is absent. Mr. Land?
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, the consent agenda, all matters of the consent agenda are to be approved by one action without discussion unless a board member requires separate action on a specific item. Does any trustee wish to pull an item from the consent agenda for discussion? Seeing none, the consent agenda is approved by unanimous consent. Item number 2, Historic Benefit Review Project Status Report and Project Updates. Executive Director Rentschler.
Thank you, Chair Cavanis. Closed with your board materials is the Historical Benefit Review Project Status Report. It reflects the corrections processed this month, along with an old one from March that didn't get previously reported. If you have any questions regarding the report, I'm happy to answer any questions at this time.
Seeing none. Do we have any public comment?
There is no public comment.
Okay. This is just informational. It's not an action item. Our next agenda item is investment matters. So Naveen is actually coming here in person. So we're going to skip over this for a moment and go on to agenda item 4. Fiscal year 23-24 final budget report. Robert Rivles, Retirement Financial Investment Officer, presenter.
Trustees, you have before you the final year, fiscal year 24 budget update report. There's some minor differences between the report you'd already seen and the report received today. I detail those in the brief memo. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yes. I'm sorry, I could.
Training.
You're asking for more in-house training from our consultants?
Excuse me. Is Mike on? Got it. The question is, are our expenses up from our consultants giving us more training?
No.
Thank you. Hard.
Is there any further discussion? Is there any public comment?
There is none.
Okay, we're moving on to agenda item number 5, succession plan policy. Director Rentschler.
Thank you, Chair Cavanis. As discussed last month, this policy follows the process lined out as far as the succession planning process for MSERA, and the policy is presented today for board adoption. If you have any questions regarding the policy, I'm happy to address them at this time. Mr. Shoemaker.
sorry I didn't bring this up or notice it before, but where there are what I would consider significant moves or changes by the executive director or the RFIO, I think it should be codified in the policy that those will be a consultation with at least the board chair, if not the executive committee, at any point that any of these are implemented. Well, we have things like making assignments. This could
So yes, the
Yeah, you know,
policy
it-
was drafted such that if there was like an unplanned event, I get hit by the bus or something, that the retirement finance investment officer would perform as acting until there is a direction from the board to alter that. Now, if you would like, we can modify the policy to say that we would consult with the chair. But you're correct, as written, it defaults to that without any board action until the board takes action, since the board often meets only once a month. And we didn't want to leave a vacuum in leadership of the organization until the board could meet and make those determinations. But we can modify the policy if that's the wish of the board.
Well, it's not that the actions take effect when they need to. It is communication, most basically. That the communication starts immediately upon realizing that any of the more significant instances installing and acting or whatever occur. That's my point. It's not getting permission to do that. This is written fine in that regard. But again, the leader of the board or the executive committee should be right on top of this right away when it starts to happen.
I can certainly add a sentence or language to the policy that in the event of an absence or a vacancy, that the chair is immediately notified. Then the chair can take additional action to notify the trustees or arrange a committee.
That'd be great. Then another question is, it says there's a 2-week limit on an acting position. Is that a county policy?
The vacancy has to be at least 2 weeks long to get the acting designation. It can run, I believe, up to 6 months or a year, but if I was only gone for a week, it wouldn't be deemed an acting. That person would simply be performing sort of out of class any task that came up. But to actually have the title of acting assigned, according to county policy, the absence has to be at least 2 weeks long.
Or, how to put this, likely 2 weeks long? I mean, if there was some kind of hit by the bus situation.
I'm not sure exactly how HR administers it, and I can check into that. Do you have comment, Trustee Cromer?
I do, and based on my day job, I'll call it, my understanding is it's based on pay periods because there is a pay incentive associated with it, so that's why the 2-week time period is associated with that terminology in
if I got hit by the bus in the middle of a pay period, it
likely would not
wouldn't
take effect until the next pay period.
And so really, before it could even take effect, you're looking at wanting a 3-week absence, because that acting assignment would be valid for the entire pay period when it goes effective.
So that sounds like a pay issue. I'm thinking more of a responsibility issue.
My thoughts on that are that the RFIO position would serve as backup to my role. Even if it's not an official assignment of an acting, it would be the position responsible for fulfilling duties that came up that needed to be done. If Robert was, absent, then his duties would likely be spread between the analyst and myself to provide some coverage until we made other arrangements, and it would be essentially working out of class as opposed to an acting assignment. Although out of class, technically those assignments also run by pay period on the pay issue, but the duties would be the responsibility of the RFIO in my absence.
So the explanation of that makes my very first point more important, that there's immediate communication with the president, the chair of the board, and
Certainly.
that they can notify that things are happening at the office.
I'm happy to add that language and bring the policy back next month for the board's review to see what was added, if that would be the pleasure of the board.
If that's a pleasure.
Trustee Cromer?
To provide a little further explanation, I think most job specifications in the county include the language, other duties as assigned. So when it is a short term, like the executive director is out of town for a 4-day period at a training or out of state, that language would take effect. If something comes up in her absence, then Robert would fill that role. It's more when this is expected to be 2 weeks or longer as to why this policy should exist and will exist. But I believe most positions in the county have other duties as assigned, and that's where it covers that on the short-term basis or when something comes up when somebody's absent.
Trustee Land? Oh, okay.
Trustee Jordy.
Oh, Trustee Jordy.
Thanks. I was wondering maybe on page 4, bullet point 3 starts on page 3, but it goes on to page 4. If maybe there could be an item C added, and this has to do with minimizing disruptions, sort of planning ahead for something we're hoping won't happen. And that would be providing the board with maintaining a list and providing the board with a copy of recruiters who have lists of people who can serve in the capacity. So, for example, in the two times that this position's been filled, the MSARA board used a specific recruiter who brought forward names, including yours, in the most recent recruitment. It's possible, it seems to me, probable that same person has a list, because she told us that she had a list of people who were interested in applying, who she thought would be interested and maybe a good fit for this job. I would imagine someone like that individual, and maybe there's others, that kind of have a list of people who aren't just looking for a permanent assignment, but are capable and available for a temporary assignment. So,
yeah, I did speak with the recruiting firm that placed me regarding that and found out what they would charge for something like that. They don't do the level of background check, but they could find someone based on their contacts in the industry. I also have a list of contacts in the industry of people who have retired or things like that who would be willing to potentially serve in a short-term capacity while the board was searching for a permanent replacement or something like that. So we do have some information regarding that. I'd be happy to provide a list of recruiting firms to the board, but I wouldn't be providing any individual names of folks that I've spoken to, but I literally have spoken with people to confirm that they would be willing to at least be approached to see if they would be available to serve in a short-term capacity.
understood. I mean, this particular item, it seemed to me, was kind of like, as you said, kind of get hit by the bus. In that case, you yourself would be potentially not available to even participate. And so that's why I thought the purpose of this document in part was providing some background material for staff and for the MSARA board in the event that you weren't able to participate in that process.
Certainly, and I can add a bullet point to item 3 of the policy to address that. And the RFIO would have access to my notes regarding people that I've spoken to.
Is there any further discussion? Is there any public comment?
There is no public comment.
So, direction to staff or direction?
Yeah, Jeff, do we need a motion to table this and to bring it back next month, or?
No, you can just have direction with the proposed changes and bring it back.
Okay, direction to staff.
Another comment, I think the policy is solid. I like, the policy also about cross-training, essential functions is important. Thank you for good work.
Okay, we're going to go to agenda item number 3, investment matters. And first up is affordable housing education. Presenter Mr. Reveles and Nuveen. And I am asking the board to please hold questions and comments until after the presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, trustees. Today we have an educational session on U.S. affordable housing. As trustees are aware, the multifamily sector has performed well over the past few years and continues to have a modestly positive outlook. Today we're going to dive into detail on affordable housing subtypes, return characteristics, and see examples of the types of property this particular strategy invests in. It's important to note that the education today is part of our broader education effort and not intended to be a recommendation on any investment strategy, even though staff believe knowledge of the subsector may be helpful in future discussions on real estate. Today we have members of Nuveen here, and they're going to provide an overview into the affordable housing subsector. We've got Pamela West, Portfolio Manager for Impact Investing. We've got Nadir Settles, Global Head of Impact Investing. Camille Jacobson, Assistant Vice President for Institutional Business Development. And Iva Kleisanen, Managing Director and Real Estate Specialist. With that, Camille, I'll hand it over to you. Oh, great, we have that up.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having us here today. I speak for the team when I say we are really excited to be here and to be leading an educational session for you all on a topic that we feel incredibly passionate about and an investment area that we feel incredibly convicted on, which is, as Robert mentioned, affordable housing real estate. Our goal for the session today is just to maximize the value, the insights, and the benefits that you all take away today. So with that, we have left a chunk of time at the end for questions, should you have them. So as we go through, if you could just write them down, any questions that come to mind. We do want this to be for your benefit. This is your session. As Robert mentioned, I'm Camille Jacobson, and I'm part of Nuveen's institutional relationship team. I work primarily with the firm's West Coast-based public pension clients, and I'm based out of San Francisco, so not too far from all of you. I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves as well. They are here from New York and Los Angeles.
Hi, I'm Pamela West. I'm the portfolio manager for what we're doing across our affordable housing strategy.
Hi, I'm Eva Kleisanen. I'm a real estate specialist based out of our LA office, and I help clients like yourself with your real estate mandates.
Hello, my name is Nadir Settles, and appreciate you guys taking the time and inviting us to educate you on the affordable housing space. Just as background, I'm our sector head, and that includes everything we do, from anything we buy, sell, asset manage, all of our execution. We're a vertically integrated group, so we have property management, construction, development, execution capabilities. We've been in this space for a long time as an asset owner. TIAA is our parent company, and today we are the largest affordable housing owner with $8 billion in assets. So we talk about this from as an asset owner, as we think about ourselves, putting ourselves in your shoes and ensuring the lifetime income of retirees, why we think this strategy makes sense.
So before we get into the good stuff, you guys might be thinking, who is Nuveen? What does Nuveen do? So I will give a very quick high-level intro, and then I will pass it off to my colleagues. So Nuveen is an asset management firm. We oversee about $1.2 trillion in assets under management, and the majority of that, or I guess you can view us as the investment management arm of our parent company, as Nadir mentioned, TIAA. So the majority of our assets are managed on behalf of our parent company's general account, the TIAA general account, and the remainder is third-party capital that we invest on behalf of our clients, and those include institutions very similar to Mendocino County. And at Nuveen, we invest across traditional asset classes, so we have your public equities, your public fixed income, But really the bread and butter of what we do is our alternatives business. So we invest in private equity, private credit, real assets, and of course, real estate, which we're here to talk to you guys all about today. And under the real estate umbrella, we do core and non-core. So within the core sleeve, I'm told that you guys are all familiar with the term Odyssey. So we have a strategy that is very similar to the one that you guys have in your retirement portfolio that invests across the real estate sectors. And then should an investor be looking to add just a little bit of retail exposure or a little bit of multifamily exposure to complement their broader Odyssey exposure, we have solutions that can help them do that as well. And then on the non-core side, we invest in more niche real estate sectors. So we do things like self-storage, infrastructure, and of course, affordable housing real estate. So with that, I will pass it off.
I think, can everybody hear us, so this way we don't have to go back and? Oh,
Got it.
got you, okay, all right.
Yeah. So I think it's just really good to start off with like why this strategy, right, makes sense. And I think everybody understands there's an affordable housing crisis across the U.S. And so I kind of want to dig into like how we got here and what it is. So I don't know who's controlling the slide, but maybe we can actually start on page 6. Yeah, perfect. So I think this is really illustrative of why we have an affordable housing crisis, or the start of it. On the left-hand side, what you will see is over the past several decades, we have had basically wage stagnation, especially in the lower income earning part of the population. And, so those lines at the bottom on the left there show just, really flat wage stagnation over the last few decades. The top line there are the higher income earners, and those salaries and incomes have been increasing over time. What's causing a lot of the housing crisis that we have is that graph on the right, which shows rent inflation over that same period of time. And so rent inflation has really outpaced wages across the U.S., and so it's just created an affordability issue within housing in general. Judy, if we go to the next page. There are two things I want to point out on this particular slide, which are on the right-hand side. What's happened too over time is when you look at housing across the U.S. in general and the lower income profile, what you see in the bar charts at the top right-hand side is an imbalance of supply and demand. So when we think about people who are earning, less than 80% of area median income, what you find is the housing that's available to income earners at that level, there's just not enough supply. There's a huge imbalance. That becomes inverted over time. So once you get above that 80% of AMI and you get to 100% of AMI, what you'll find is that inverts, and there's more supply at that end of the market for residents across the U.S. And why is that? Because everything we build today tends to be across the U.S., maybe not here in this county, as I'm told by Robert, but across the U.S., what we find is developers are developing Class A assets, and those Class A assets are targeting those higher income earners who can afford it. And so you will find that supply at the bottom end of the market, or at the lower income earners, it's just not enough there for people who are earning that. At the bottom right-hand side, I want to take a minute to explain what's going on here. Are people familiar with tax credits, with housing tax credits? So the Reagan administration, right, developed the tax credit program back in 1986. And this was really to incentivize developers and tax credit investors through an IRS function, right, to come in and help develop and finance affordable housing. And it's actually been a really great program. It's been supported by every single administration over the years. What it does is it incentivizes developers through paying them out a developer fee, and it incentivizes a tax credit investor. It could be a bank, it could be a corporation that needs to lower their corporate tax rate or their tax rate to come in and help finance the capital stack for affordable housing. And what they get for that is kind of this dollar for dollar reduction in their taxes by helping to finance affordable housing. It's an IRS function. It's a 10-year benefit. That program started back in 1986. So it brought this kind of public-private partnership into play to develop affordable housing. That housing came with like a 30 to 40-year deed restriction, right? And if we do the math today, we know that a lot of those deals are expiring. That program developed 3.5 million units today, right, from 1986 until today. We have a 7 million unit deficit in the U.S. So it's not building enough of that supply to address, and it really targets that 50 and 60% of area median income resident within that housing. And so this chart at the bottom shows you that we have units expiring out of that program, out of those deed restrictions that are at risk for being converted to market rate. So we already have a 7 million unit deficit. There's another 650,000 units expiring by 2030. So it's just creating a bigger imbalance across the U.S. In supply and demand. So Judy, if we go to this next slide. Thank you. I'm going to just kind of quickly go through these because I think what's important here to note is that this is the low-income housing tax credit program that we talk about. And those tax credits are pushed, they're voted on at the federal level, that allocation, but it's pushed down into each state by a per capita basis. And so what we've seen is, and this is just to show you that it's been supported over time by the government, no matter who's in administration at the time. And so it's a great way to continue to develop those properties under the tax credit program. Unfortunately, we're just not able to develop enough of it. So, Judy, I'm going to ask that we go back to, because I thought it was important to explain that first, to page 5. So with that said, TIAA has been investing in affordable housing for over 30 years, and they actually started out on the financing side of affordable housing. They came together with 11, TI is an insurance company, they came together with 11 other insurers to create this company called Impact Community Capital that's actually out in San Francisco. They help finance affordable housing, and they're still a part owner of that. So that was our first, entry into affordable. Over time, what we've done is switched our investment. We still invest through Impact Community Capital on the debt side, but we switched our investment over to equity because we saw this growing need to preserve housing, to preserve that stock of housing that I just talked about, right? The stock of housing that targets everyone under 80, who's making under 80% of area median income, because that housing is quickly being acquired by market rate buyers and being converted. And so these are kind of the 3 areas that we have played in affordable housing. And, you may hear that people refer to this as capital A affordable housing and lowercase a affordable housing. There's a lot of terms, so, if a question comes up, please ask. But the first column is what we call rent subsidized housing. That is just typical Section 8 housing. The government, provides a contract that sits atop that real estate. It's like a 25-year contract. There are markup to markets for rent in those contracts. But what's really important here is the residents only pay 30% of their income towards rent. When you think about what's happened across the U.S., as I explained, the imbalance of supply and the wage stagnation and rent inflation, we have severely rent-burdened residents across the U.S., meaning they're either paying more than 30% or even more than 50% of their income towards rent, right? And when you back into the numbers, and based on housing agency formulas and calculations, as US citizens, we should only be paying about 30% of our income towards housing cost. But here in the US, we have a little bit more than half of the population paying over 30% of their income. In New York, which is where I live, our residents pay about 66% of their income towards housing cost, which is really crazy. But that is the reality of the situation. So this rent subsidized column is Section 8. The residents here only pay rent based on their income, and they only pay rent based on 30% of their income. And so no matter where the rents are in the market, as an investor, as a owner investor, you receive market level rent. That's mainly subsidized by the government. The government's not making new Section 8 contracts. So there are a number of assets that have these contracts, and they're traded in the market by investors. But largely when an investor or owner gets this type of asset, they hold on to it for 30, 40 years because it's such a great cash flowing, durable cash flowing asset in the market. This second, our middle column, is income restricted, which is what we call the expiring low-income housing tax credit deals. So these are exiting out of the program, the tax credit program. The developer, the tax credit investor, they've both gotten their benefit in that the developer's been paid their developer fee, the tax credit investor has gotten their tax credit benefit, and they both want to sell the property. And so we are buying these assets and also preserving them long-term. So we're extending the deed restrictions here. We are hopefully maybe putting them back into that tax credit program where they would get a significant rehab through a new developer, a new tax credit investor. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions around that, which I'm happy to answer. And then this last column, which we call naturally occurring affordable housing. This is just typical, your Class B, Class C assets. There are no deed restrictions. There are no income restrictions here. Where we see this opportunity is those are really being scooped up by market rate buyers who want to implement some sort of value add program. So market rate buyers see these B and C class assets. They say, hey, we can put 15 to 20,000 a unit in capital into these projects, but in return for that, we can get an increase of $400 to $500 from the resident. What happens in these assets is when they are bought by market rate buyers, they are displacing every single person who lives there because they cannot afford the increase or the bump. And so we're buying these, we're actually self-regulating them to target that 60% of area median income, backing into having the resident only pay 30% of their income here. But we're also working with cities and counties who will sometimes give us a tax abatement in exchange for deed restricting, because the counties really want to preserve affordable housing in their markets as well. And so they see by giving us a benefit, we're able to do that, and we're able to preserve it long term. So they will actually give us a deed restriction that's longer than maybe we would even own it, which is great, because we want whoever buys this property from us at the end of the day, after maybe a 10-year hold, to continue to preserve this asset as affordable. And so that's our strategy there. We're buying those in really high growth corridors. So we own a couple of deals in LA. We own some deals out around DC. And so that's where we see the best opportunity to preserve these assets. Right. So Judy, we can go back to, I think, some of the return characteristics. You let me know where you want to pick up and keep talking. Okay, all right. So on page 15. I think you all are familiar with the Odyssey, and what you'll see here is traditional multifamily. This is all encompassing of all multifamily, has really outperformed over time. It's one of the most stable investments that you can make. If you saw this same index for office or retail, it would look very different than this one. But as you can see, even in the downturns, which are the lines that drop below zero, which we're doing the great financial crisis, the GFC, and then in the last downturn where we dealt with the pandemic and the recent downturn, you will see after those moments, multifamily typically recovers, and it fully recovers. And so it's one of the most stable investments that you can have over time. On the next page, Judy, you'll see also the resiliency of this asset class just in occupancy and revenue. And that's really because, and this is compared to, so the light green line is affordable housing, that darker green line is just traditional market rate or multifamily. But what you'll see is you're able to de-risk, right, a lot of the noise in affordable housing because you are receiving some of that government subsidy. So over time, we've outperformed market rate housing, and that's not we, Nuveen, but the market in general has outperformed market rate housing and affordable housing by receiving that revenue, more revenue than multifamily. And then the occupancies also are much higher. People tend to live in affordable housing, you know, where you might see a 12-month lease or someone rent in a Class A apartment for a year or two. In affordable housing, those residents tend to have an average of 3 to 5 years leasing in those units, sometimes upward to 10 years, and sometimes it even becomes a generational, right, thing where the families just live in those assets for a very long time. They don't have the discretionary income to move a lot, number one, and so that's the reason the occupancies are really high. But the other reason is there's just not enough housing. There's nowhere for them to go. And so they end up staying within that housing for really long periods of time. On the next slide, Judy, this is just our own tracking. So we took the pandemic and we said, listen, this is the worst part of the market. The pandemic, we had the downturn, interest rates were going up at the time, and so we kind of carved out a moment of time when we felt like things were, really bad in the market, and we compared our own budget to actuals. So we didn't make any reforecast. We said, let's just see how this asset class performs during the worst time in the market. And what you'll see here at the top of this page is that our occupancy was actually higher than what we budgeted. These properties stay almost 100% occupied all the time with significant wait lists. And the bottom chart here just kind of breaks down the strategy by the three things I mentioned to you earlier, Section 8, expiring tax credit deals, and the NOAA deals. But these stay very well occupied. Across our portfolio, we have about 32,000 units. We have 160 properties. Most of them are in the high 90% occupancies. A lot of them are at 100% occupancy. We have a deal in Irvine, California that is 100% occupied. There are 200 people on the wait list there just waiting to get into that asset. The assets that we own in New York, and we'll go through a case study here for one of those, there are at least 900 people on every single asset that we own in New York just waiting. And we empty out those lists. We refresh them over time because they do get stale. Within 24 hours, we'll have that same number on the wait list again. And that's just, again, speaks to the imbalance that we see in the market. Judy, if we go to the next page, taking that same time period, we looked at our revenue, we looked at our cash flow, and to see how that performed as well. And so what you'll see here is even during the worst part of the market, we were able to see revenue gains and increases over time. And that's really coming from the government subsidy. The government wants us to be good owners and operators of these assets. So we continue to receive, some markups in rent that don't impact the resident at all. And so we were able to collect more revenue over time during the pandemic. And then this bottom chart just shows our cash flow. And what you'll see from the bright green line there's a little bit of volatility in the cash flow coming from expenses, and that is because I call it the COVID expenses, number one. That was us cleaning our properties 3 times a day for our age-restricted or senior assets, because we felt like they were the most vulnerable population during COVID. And so we really beefed up our cleaning budget there. And then insurance costs. So I think we're all familiar with what's going on in the insurance world. But we saw some increases with insurance over time. So that created a little bit of volatility, but I would say only the COVID expenses were really tied to what was happening during this moment in time. Judy, if we go to page 20. So this is the case study of the Irvine deal I just mentioned to you. It's a Section 8 asset, and I know people kind of chuckle when I say that we have affordable housing in Irvine, because we all know Irvine's not the most affordable area to live in, but we do. We own this asset in Irvine. It's a Section 8 asset. Again, it's 100% occupied. I just spoke about it. There's 200 people on the wait list. What we did was, this was an expiring tax credit transaction. So the developer was actually a nonprofit. They had a tax credit investor in. The tax credit investor wanted to get out of the deal. The nonprofit developer was really personally tied to this transaction because they had actually developed this from its initial. It had gone through the LIHTC resyndication one time, but they had held this property for 40 years. And so they asked us if they could stay in as part of the ownership for this property, and we granted that to them. And they've been a great partner. They provide services here. We have a number of, of things we do for the aging population. I was just there the other day. We've put a garden out back, and I think this is an interesting story in that, one thing we want to combat in some of these age-restricted assets in our aging population. First of all, we want to help people age in place and not go into a nursing home. And so we try to provide services that help them out. But one of the things we do have to combat here is social isolation. And so that was a garden. We put a garden there. Every resident here wants to be in the garden at the same time. We had to create a lottery. But there are a number of other services that we provide, such as food bank deliveries, hot subsidized meals, access to health care. So there are people that come in and check blood pressure. There are a number of things we do here. But this asset has performed really wonderfully from an investment standpoint, in that the government provided us with a 30% increase on the rent that we were receiving here. And so because of that, we were able to really maintain and upgrade this property. And so the picture you see in the bottom right is an actual unit where we put capital into that unit to upgrade it and replace some of the older appliances, the older cabinets, the older countertops. And it's made a huge difference for the residents. The second, the next slide. The second transaction is a family expiring tax credit deal. We just acquired it last year. It is in Seattle, and so there are a number of different families that live here. There could also be seniors who live here as well. And so this, again, is another asset that we see an opportunity to put a little capital into it, and it will probably go back through that LIHTC program. And because we are now vertically integrated, as Nadir mentioned earlier, we can sit in the position of the developer. We can find our tax credit investor, and we could really significantly rehabilitate this property through that program. The next slide, Judy, is an example of the naturally occurring affordable asset, or what I call market rate affordable. This asset had no restrictions, no subsidy, government subsidy on it. It stays very well occupied. There are a number of families here. There are 12 yellow buses that pull up to pick up kids here from school to go to school every day. So it's a very important property to this is just outside of DC in Hyattsville. It's a very important property to that community. There's a nonprofit organization that we actually have on property that provides a number of different services to the residents. And the city has asked us to think about developing a public library because we have a lot of green space on this property. And so we're actually talking to them about doing that because it is so significant for children to live here in this area and the schools that are surrounding. But this has been an amazing property as well. The picture in the center of that is a renovated unit where we've actually placed capital. We should have actually shown it before and after because this is a pretty amazing change. And then it's very infrequent that you will see an affordable housing asset that has a pool. And so we were really excited to have a pool here, which, you know, now we can teach life skills such as swimming lessons to children. And so that's, you know, that is a very rare sighting in affordable housing because the programs that, you know, were developed in this country don't require that you put these types of amenities, but you need them in market rate. You don't see them so much in affordable housing. I will turn over Archer Green to Nadir.
So as we go through our case studies here, a lot of what we do on the development side is work with public-private partnership and ways that we get tax abatements, contributions to land, variances, zoning. And so for Archer Green, this was a special project because it was in an underutilized community in Queens where it was a parking lot for police, but they just parked their vehicles and a lot of crime and different things were happening. And so we worked with the New York EDC and contributed the land. We ended up building sub-parking for the police vehicles. And then we built what we call a great regenerative development, to where we built 400 units of affordable housing from various different AMI units, from formerly homeless, people live here, all the way up to people that are earning 100%, 130% of AMI, but paying 100%. Within here, we got about 72,000 of retail, and that retail serves not only the residents, but the community. So there's a fresh grocer, there's a kids zone, there's a adult daycare. And what's interesting about this project is about 10% of these residents actually work within that region. And so not only does it serve as the amenity, but it also serves as employment. And so that's the sort of development. This development here is really interesting because with 400 units, we have a 70,000 wait. And so that just shows, and you know, to Pamela's point around and that's on the extreme side. I mean, we have wait lists that are 200 people, as she talked about in Irvine, California. But that just shows where the challenge is with affordable housing and people, you know, needing the units to be established. So that's a little bit about Archer Green and our development there. And
I'll just one thing about the Archer development because really when we talk about affordable housing is this, when you think about the tax credit program and how that develops housing across the country, it's a great program and we absolutely need it, but it targets just a specific lower income earner. All of the units target a specific lower income earner. I think as we think about developing affordable housing across the country, we should be thinking about it in this particular format of mixed income, right, mixed use. And so that's what this is, in that, you know, over 60% of this building does serve that lower income unit, all the way down to what we call supportive housing. So formerly homeless families also live here, but also people who make over 100% of area median income live here. And addressing the food desert, you know, is something we should also think about instead of, you know, just plopping housing in the middle of nowhere with no access to amenities. And so, you know, the grocery store here is amazing. It's used by everybody in the community. The kids club is used by everybody in the community. It's not just this building. And the numbers Nadir said are, you know, it's crazy to think that 70, you know, we have a serious problem in New York with housing and affordability, in that, you know, average rent in New York is about $4,000 per unit. And so, you know, that's why we have 70,000 people who were applying for these just 400 units. I think we can stop there and hopefully take questions. Robert, is that okay?
Yeah, can we briefly go through the subtypes, like pages, slides 10, 11,
Oh, sure.
12, just to go through those? We don't have to spend a lot of time, but.
Oh, yes. On page 10, this just talks about the process of the tax credit deal and what's called resyndication. So you have that public-private partnership that I described, where you have the developer and you have the tax credit investor. They want to, after that 10-year benefit is over, there's a 5-year look back where the IRS says, hey, did everybody, right, complete their paperwork correctly? Was everything filed appropriately? And so it's a 15-year process. At the end of year 15, everybody wants to sell, right? The developer, the tax credit investor. And that's when we come in and we will actually buy those assets and hold them, preserve them. We will put a little capital into them because by now they're 15 years old. We put some capital, excuse me, and then we can apply to have that asset go back into that public-private partnership again. And so that's where we can sit in the developer seat, we can find a tax credit investor, and we can completely rehabilitate that program through using the tax credit investors' financing for that project. And there's very little equity needed to actually do these deals because it's mainly financed through the tax credit investment and some bonds.
And just as a sort of an anchor of how much credit comes through there. So if you think about the rehabilitation, so not the development, you're typically receiving 25 to 50% of tax credit equity for that, right? And then the rest is going to be some sort of taxes and bonds, other soft debt and financing. For a ground-up development, you're typically receiving from a tax credit equity perspective about 50 to 60% of the equity, just to give some range on the capitalization of how much equity can help to fund these deals. And that equity is then used for the rehabilitation to improve, buy up the age, and actually re-establish those units in a way that is best in class, right, after they go through that process. And so you've not only preserved it, but as a developer, what's also in there as part of being funded of that capital stack is your developer fee, as Pamela talked about. So now you're getting your developer fee, you've established this best-in-class new housing, and you've preserved it long-term again. And then for ground-up development, that 50 or 60% sort of is to construct that new building.
Judy, on page 11. Oh, you're already there. This is the Section 8, the way the Section 8 contract works. And so there are two avenues in Section 8. One is what I described, where there's a contract that sits with a building. It is funded through the government federal budget. It's voted on every year, that funding. And the government anticipates any markup in rents that you might receive through this government funding. So it's voted on at the federal level. It's distributed down to the local housing agencies, and the local housing agencies then provide those payments directly to the owner or the landlord, right? So they're collecting, and I would say it's about 70% of the rent that comes from the government on these assets, and that's kind of a general statement. It just depends on the level of income for each resident there, but generally backs into about 70%, and then the 30% of the remainder of the rent is paid by that resident. So that's one thing, is the contract that sits atop the housing. And so you get contractual bumps in rent, and you also, there's an annual inflationary hedging instrument that considers the fact that your expenses in housing are constantly going up. And so as owners, we submit our expenses and show, right, where there has been some inflation, and the government will help cover some of that inflation. Not all of it, but some of it annually. And that's just to make sure that, like, we're good owners of the assets that we're maintaining the building. properly. And so because of that, they do audits, right? They come in, they look at, they inspect every single unit to make sure that we're taking care of those units and maintaining them in a way that they feel is appropriate. And there's a whole scorecard behind that. The way the government is moving now, so I mentioned earlier that they're not creating new Section 8 contracts for buildings. You've probably heard of a Section 8 voucher or portable voucher. And so the government that's what they're issuing these days. They're trying to increase the voucher program because as a resident who's earning under 80% of AMI, they want residents, because of this imbalance of supply and demand, to be able to rent in market rate units and take that voucher, which acts the same way, right? The government pays about 70%, resident pays about 30%. And so you would think owners and landlords everywhere would be excited that they have stable cash flow coming in for at least 70% of their rent. But the reality of the situation is a lot of those residents are turned away in market rate units, and they're not allowed to rent there. And so those are the portable vouchers. We welcome portable vouchers in our tax credit deals, as well as the naturally occurring affordable housing assets. And so that's part of the stability of the income that we see throughout our portfolio as well. And there are about 3 million families who currently use this program.
Could you elaborate how the tax credit works? I'm understand that there would be a credit, but could you go through some of the steps so I can see the sort of beginning to end type of?
Yeah, and I can start it and then you take over, which is, so there are qualified asset plans in every single city, state, right, county across the country. And they're different based on whatever the local government feels like they need for housing. And so as a developer, you will first submit a plan that there's a lot of check boxes, right? Like how large are the units? How many units are there? What is the unit mix? You know, how many 1-bedrooms are you creating? How many 2-bedrooms? How many 3-bedrooms? What types of services can you provide here? What are the amenities that will be at the property? Are you implementing sustainability, you know, within your development plan? And so there are a lot of boxes to check in that application that you have to submit to the local government, city, state, to actually get approved for tax credits. You then go on a list because a lot of developers are submitting their applications. You get graded, you get a score. And so if you have a higher score because you're doing a lot of the things that the state wants you to do to develop housing, then you move to kind of the top of the list and you're eligible to receive whatever tax credits have been allocated to the state by the federal government. So, right, the federal government says, you know, we approve, call it $20 billion, and then that state gets, you know, $1 billion or whatever the number is. And they have to decide at the local level how they want to use that $1 billion to develop affordable housing in their state because they know better. They know where affordable housing's needed. They know how and what they need in affordable housing. And so that's how they come up with their development plans.
I think you hit it spot on.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add is that that same process is actually a state process too. So the state actually can award state credits that can combine with the federal credits that come, but the process works the same.
So the developer, right, if they are approved, their application's approved, will move forward with a project, but they have to then go out and find a tax credit investor. And that tax credit investor, they're what are called syndicators in the market. And syndicators are like JP Morgan is a syndicator, Wells Fargo, you know, there are a ton of syndicators, Bank of America, that are syndicators. They will help find the tax credit investor, right? So they're kind of like it's kind of like brokering a deal. So they go out to all of these banks, they go out to corporates, they go out to, right, other investors who are looking to reduce their corporate taxes. And they basically kind of create a little bidding, right, war amongst the different potential tax credit investors. And then you eventually select the right tax credit investor for the type of capital that you need for that project. And so they will essentially buy those tax credits to help fund the financing of affordable housing. And for that, they get a dollar for dollar reduction through the IRS, through the Section 42 code of the IRS.
One thing I would add here is that they also can be a participant and buyer of the tax credits as they are required through the CRA requirement, which is the Community Investment Act. Through that act, demands that as they do business in certain communities, that they actually have to provide loans and financing, and they could also do it through tax credits to meet that requirement of the people in that community. And so the banks can be buyers of these tax credits as well.
So the assets take about, I would say, 18 months to develop. And the developer will probably fund some upfront development costs due to, right, getting architectural plans, you know, whatever they need to do from an environmental study maybe. They will fund that. When they get all of the funding from the tax credit investor, from the state, as Nadir said, what happens is the developer will receive just a portion of their development fee upfront, right? And then the tax credit investor will start their year one tax benefit that will go for 10 years. It's a 10-year tax benefit. And so that starts that. I think it's really smart that the program doesn't allow the developer to receive all of their fee up front, right? Because we know the outcome of that is developers would take their fee, develop the deal, and then they be off to the next deal. So what they do is they spread that development fee out through that 10-year period to make sure that both parties are incentivized to stay in the deal, to manage the deal, to take care of the deal to apply appropriately, to apply or submit, right, compliance and audit to the IRS, to the housing agencies to make sure that that property is running smoothly.
What section? Yes, but what section of the IRS tax code generates the tax credit? I mean, if I were to go to the IRS tax code, where would I find this?
It's Section 42.
Thank you.
Sure.
Good, thanks. So in the presentation, it looks like on page 15 that we've spent a little time looking at. If I'm reading it correctly, this is sort of the aggregate of the industry in terms of their returns over about a more than decade-long period. Okay. So I realize this is an educational presentation, not specifically to your portfolio or product, but in the context of education, where would investments like yours, which seem to be focused more on affordable housing versus the total rental housing market, what would this chart look like if it was more in your niche area?
So unfortunately, affordable housing is not broken. Like this is just the multifamily view for all of multifamily. There is no Odyssey or benchmark yet for affordable housing. What we have done is we backed our portfolio sort of into this model to see what it would look like. And our performance it was about, during the pandemic, it was about 190 bips above the benchmark. And that's because where market rate multifamily is cyclical, right? Because you're dealing with people paying their rent, there is no sort of backstop from the government there. And your occupancies are low, excuse me. So you're losing income from renters who can move, right? Who are not paying. You're losing revenue, right? Because you don't have the backstop. And so what you see here is a little of that volatility. in affordable housing, and we did track this over time, there has not been a lot of, and I can tell you this here, is that we've seen markdowns over the pandemic in our multifamily market rate side that have been about 8 to 10%. In the affordable side, we've seen 1 to 3%, right, on a markdown in valuation. And that is because we've still been able to achieve high occupancy. We've been able to collect our revenue. So you wouldn't see these major drops or dips during a downturn.
So just big picture.
There's a lot of downside, there's a lot of downside protection here in affordable housing because of that government backstop.
So I guess if you were making a presentation to a retirement board specifically about your product, you would be showing us your specific returns, not just these aggregates.
Correct.
Maybe a comparison, but you would be.
Correct.
Okay. I just wanted to note that everyone on the board knows, I don't know if you know, that we over time have shifted 11% of the portfolio to real estate and another 6 to infrastructure.
Okay.
And I personally think that that has been a good move for the retirement board. I personally feel like we still have too much in bonds, which are, in my opinion, hurting the fund, with a decade-long return of about 2%, which was less than inflation. And when I look at this number, which I realize is not your particular product, and I'm looking at the real estate returns in this market segment, I'm seeing, without having done the compounded math, but just using rough math, it looks like the appreciation over this time period was roughly 4% a year, maybe a little bit more. And that income on top.
That's good math, actually.
And on top of that, the income averaged, although it's been trending down, averaged about 5% a year. So that's a 9.5% or 9+% return, total return, which would be phenomenal for a pension fund to have anything close to that as a big holding within their fund. Certainly better than bonds will ever do in our lifetime, and the rest of our lifetime anyway. And so, I look at the steadiness of that income as being bond-like for a pension fund. So, I'm going off this board at the end of this year, but I just hope that there is a serious questioning of Callan that's been advising us that we need to have as much in bonds as we do. I don't think we do. We have so much cash flow coming into this plan, we can almost make all cost payments just from the cash flow in. We only need about $8 million in dividends, yield, whatever you want to call it, in addition to our cash flow into the plan to cover the cost of the plan. So I think proposals like yours are intriguing, and I think if there was a presentation in the future specifically to the product, I think it would be interesting for the board to look at that in comparison to bonds, as opposed to, I personally wouldn't be taking more money out of stocks, I'd be taking it out of bonds.
And if I can add, and this just anecdotally, what we see is about, in the affordable space, is about a 12 to 12.5% return, total return. And the attribute, to your point, is about 70% from income of that return, and about 30% comes from appreciation. So it's a little bit different.
Which, of course, bonds don't have an appreciation. They only have a return.
Right.
Generally speaking, an investment strategy like you guys are utilizing for your investments, how could you explain to me that what type of insulation or protection do you have in situations like the global pandemic where there's a moratorium on evictions and people are not paying their rent? Is that covered by these tax rebates, or is it just goes against the returns?
Yeah, it does go against the returns. I think what we saw during the pandemic were, yes, are there some people who took advantage of the eviction moratoriums? Absolutely. Not a huge amount, though. Renters in affordable housing, because they have dealt with housing instability for so long, actually pay their rent on time, mostly. And I say mostly because during the pandemic, we did see, right, there were slow payers. We work with our residents. Not every affordable housing owner does that, but we work with our residents on payment plans. We try to, our property managers are adept with trying to help them access other subsidies. So it wouldn't come from a typical government subsidy unless you were in a Section 8 contract. So in a Section 8 contract, if you lost your job or you had a reduction of income, you're only paying 30% of whatever that, right? You get recertified in that situation, and yes, the government actually does kick in more for you in rent. But take our traditional naturally occurring affordable housing asset where there is no subsidy. We actually worked with those residents to access other subsidies because the cities, although there was an eviction moratorium, a lot of the cities actually did step up and provide some sort of other subsidy to their to the residents in the area. And then evictions do happen because this is government regulated. There's a government lease here that residents have to abide by. And so if they, don't abide by those, then we're forced, in some instances to have to evict. But yes, you're absolutely right. The eviction moratorium did cause some, right, noise in the collections for some residents who said, I want to take advantage of this, but they're not as many as you think.
Thank you.
Can you maybe just tell us a little more about TIAA, the owner? I mean, I was reading online, I've heard of the company for years, did not know that it stood for Teachers Insurance Annuity. Is it a for-profit, nonprofit? What's the structure of TIAA? And then your company, which is a subsidiary of TIAA?
Yeah, so, what's important about what we do, because if you think about TIAA, TIAA wakes up every day. TIAA is an insurance pension provider. So they wake up every day to provide for a lifetime income and to solve the retirement crisis. And if you think about within our ethos, affordable housing, there's two crises right now. Retirement, people feel that they don't have enough money to retire, and people feel that affordable housing is getting uncontrollable and they don't have housing security. So TIA, which is why they've always been in this as a mission-oriented company that was started by Andrew Carnegie 100 years ago. So basically, Andrew Carnegie 100 years ago started TIAA for the benefit of people that were doing well in society but wasn't retiring with dignity. If you look at the JP Morgan, the Rockefellers, they were taking care of all the high net worth folks. And so Andrew Carnegie said we have these teachers, these researchers, and all these folks that are working in nonprofit that are doing well in society and they're not being taken care of. I want to start a retirement plan just for them. So our platform largely serves those in nonprofit or those in research or those doing some sort of good in society. And then with that, over 100 years, we have matured to, we have cut more checks than the federal government from a Social Security perspective. Some time ago, we were 100% of the retirement platform that controlled teachers. Then you had other folks getting into the business. So basically what TIA did was look at it and say, well, we already self-manage our business. How can we sort of get into, as a nonprofit, so they're a nonprofit, how can we get into sort of the advisory business to basically leverage our participants' cash flows, because now they're going to own what is now the business called Nuveen. As that business grows in enterprise value, the ultimate distribution and dividend goes back to our participants. And so basically what they did is we looked around as an acquisition strategy and bought a company called Nuveen, which was largely a muni shop at the time based out of Chicago. And they brought that company, Nuveen, together with was TIAA's capabilities, which TIAA had large capabilities in alternatives and equities, merged those businesses. Nuveen is 100% owned by TIAA, works for the benefit of TIAA. So its largest client is the general account, which is TIAA's participant and balance sheet money. But then Nuveen also, and so that allows for the efficient execution of the money management of its pension side to be able to have a dedicated asset manager to do that. But the other benefit is that Nuveen can go out and raise third-party funds, which TIAA a lot of times they seed, which is why I say we're an asset owner and an asset manager. And an asset owner is first and foremost because we don't sell products. Anything that we go to commercialize, we actually believe in our own home cooking and have built a significant position on our balance sheet that we say now with our experience and our track record, we can go and commercialize it and leverage it ultimately to the benefit of the participants of TIAA. So Nuveen is a wholly owned company by TIAA, but is not a nonprofit.
Peter and I are both formerly TIAA employees that acquired new vehicles. Really long time. It's great.
And I'll add one more thing to the TIAA, because this is also important to you guys as the retirement board managers, is this does fit within the ethos of TIAA. But at the end of the day, they really thought about the economic benefit and the durability of cash flows and obligations they have long-term as a pension provider. And so that is why they go that double down on this strategy, is why they've built an $8 billion asset position, and they've launched this fund, because they believe in the double bottom line, which we are achieving. They believe that we can go and do the impact that we do in these communities, building the services, establishing quality, affordable housing. But at the end of the day, they do not take a concessionary return, nor do we as execution teams go and trade return for doing goodwill. We know that we're a fiduciary first. Our parent company relies on that for the benefits of the aspirations of how our participants want to retire. And that is very important to them to come to this, to say that this makes great economic sense. And our long-term track record, as Pamela stated, for TIAA is a 12 to 15. And that's why they really invest in this, because of that double bottom line and that double benefit, and that this is not a concessionary return for them.
Well, if their portfolio is earning 12 to 15, I bet there's not a whole lot of bonds in that portfolio.
I was just wondering, who is competing with you in this sector?
Yeah.
Who's your competitors?
So we're a little bit unique, and I'll explain why. We just talked about the opportunity from a supply-demand imbalance, investment, portfolio construction, how this is very durable, cash flow is government-backed. It makes all the sense in the world for an institutional portfolio to own this. And so you've seen a lot of institutional managers jump in this business, and it's dangerous because they don't necessarily have the depth and skills to deal with the compliance that's necessary, to deal with the relationship management for the municipalities and the government relationships and everything else, that we mobilize a team of 550 people that wake up every day to do just this work. And so you have allocators, where people that people that kind of look like TIA, they allocate capital to somebody else to have to figure out the day-to-day. And those are large asset managers such as Blackstone, Starwood, AEW could be another one right there. And so they're all probably within the 4 to 6 billion, probably not quite like us, 8 billion. They can offer a white glove fiduciary. They can offer your typically scale and large, sophisticated asset manager, but they go 5 miles wide. They have no depth. Then on the opposite range of that, you have really regionalized local operators that offer a lot of depth, a lot of expertise, and you probably have some developers right here in the county. But those guys can't offer any any diversification as far as the portfolio construction and their reach and kind of the white glove fiduciary sophistication you may need for overseeing from dealing with a investment manager. Where we sit is we offer both. So we are a large-scale asset manager. We are the largest asset manager of affordable housing. We are a large fiduciary with major front, back, and middle offices to support our execution. But then we go very deep to offering property management, development, construction, where we're the GC, and we do project oversight. We offer a full, deploy a full government relations group every day. We're touching every single county from a state, from a federal, from a local group, where our teams are actually deploying our local lobbyists, and we're understanding what's going on from a policy perspective, what could be risks, what conversations we have to have. That level, bringing that level of execution together as a large-scale asset manager puts us in a very unique place, but we do have these barbells of competitors that are out there.
Well, so let me just jump in and say, so that didn't quite answer the question. That was a good answer, but who would a competitor
So
be?
just some names would be like Blackstone, Starwood, AEW, and then on the kind of operator side would be names like Jonathan Rose, Hudson Valley Property Group, Avaneth, right? These are just some names. And sorry about that, yes, because I sort of provide the names, but I do want to provide the caution. That's why, as we just doing this education, because just to make sure as you talk to folks, that you understand the composition of what the quality of execution that they can provide.
Right, there's a variety of different investment mechanisms into affordable housing. You might have something like RBC put together a fund where you're investing in it, but they facilitate the purchase or investment in affordable housing, but they're not involved in the management of it. And, so there's different aspects. Nuveen is a broader operator in that they just don't own the asset, they're involved in the management of that asset.
Right.
So there's a lot of different flavors to affordable housing, and there's a lot of different players depending on the type of fund that you might want to get into. Not all of them, like I said, are involved in management. Some focus solely on development, and some focus on just equity ownership, but they don't do the management of it. So there's a lot of variety.
So there's no single entity that's providing the full scope of services that you're doing? Is that?
There is, and those are smaller regional developers, so then they won't give you the broader diversification.
So none that compete nationally?
None that compete nationally with
Right.
us.
But are you not really national, because you talked about some properties in LA and in New York?
Yeah, we have
New Jersey,
a
I think it was.
national footprint,
Right.
right? There's still markets that we want further inroads and penetration in, such as Colorado. But as far as how we deploy our acquisitions teams, how we look at capital, how we actually are looking at pursuit of different deals, we're looking from a national perspective.
Yeah, and just to put some numbers around it, we're in about 24 states in the U.S. and about 46 MSAs. So we have that national, like the submarkets within the states.
Okay.
So
What acronym did you use?
MSAs.
MSA.
Yes.
Okay.
And, the way that we look at the investment strategy is, where can we invest where there is a huge imbalance of supply and demand, right? That's where we want to be. 2, where is the state getting good allocations for tax credits, because that could be an opportunity to rehab or rehabilitate an asset. Are there other affordable housing investors in that market? And then our government relations team will look at how easy it is to work with, right, the political environment there, right? Can we work with them? Do they offer other programs that we could potentially tap into?
I had one other question, which is not really related, but you mentioned that there was an imbalance. This is kind of driven by imbalance, and imbalances tend to become unimbalanced given time. There's a couple of similar, I don't know what to call them, concepts such as office conversions. And is that in any way contributing to maybe that imbalance becoming a little more balanced? Is that an actual real thing now?
So we would have to, the only way to right-size the imbalance is to develop our way out of this issue. And we cannot develop enough units in the country. We never developed enough units in this country to address the deficit. I can circle back. We did a calculation. I don't remember what it is. Like, not in our lifetimes will we ever address the imbalance of supply and demand in affordable housing. And so I think that continues to be an issue over time, unless a couple things happen. This gets into economics, right? Like, I don't know that we can change wages a lot in the country to address the rent inflation that we're seeing. I don't think we can develop enough units based on construction costs today. Unless you're really developing under the tax credit program, you can only develop market rate housing for those higher incomes. Like, that's the only way that they're viable or that they pencil.
Thank you.
Trustee
You just hit on what I was going to ask about. The tax credits and the rent subsidies are gifts from the federal government, and you said they're voted on every year. does the federal government have most favored states or areas? And do they use the power of the subsidies and tax credits to push development in certain areas or penalize bad states?
It's really based on, at the end of the day, population growth. So the federal government just votes on a generic budget, and then that budget gets, every state gets its pro rata share of that budget based on on a per capita number. So they don't differentiate and say, oh my gosh, California's in more trouble, or right, New York's in more trouble, let's give them more tax credits. That's not how it happens. But the states, and Nadir sort of touched on this earlier, the states themselves are actually coming up with their own tax credit programs to subsidize that need, right? So what they don't get from the federal government, they're now, like South Carolina is one of them, Ohio is one of, so they're coming up with their own tax credit programs.
And we're seeing this, and it's not even just the states thinking about it. To the question around, is this imbalance going to equalize? People see such the dire of it's actually only getting worse, and so the municipalities are starting to think about, okay, well, how can we be innovative with capacity to bond, with budgets that we can increase for housing to help to supplement, to even continue to add to the innovation? Because if you think about it, out of this tax credit execution of building and financing homes, only 3.5 million homes have been built since 30 years. So if you got a 7 million home deficit today, it's just not gonna be able to do it. So everybody's thinking about ways, from the federal, from the state down to municipalities, on how to continue to think about the funding, the subsidizing of new affordable housing.
I just realized I did not answer your question about office conversions. And so we have looked at office conversions. TIA has an office portfolio. It's very limited in the sense that the larger offices, and it sounds like the perfect storm, right, where you could convert things like office to affordable housing. But sometimes the floor plates are way too large. Like in New York, for instance, every unit has to have a window. And the floor plates are so large, first of all, you have to build out plumbing for every single unit, versus, right, in an office, you have the bathroom with the plumbing, maybe a lounge or something with the plumbing on every floor. But you'd have to build out the plumbing, which is super expensive to do for the number of units. And then in New York, what we've seen is you'd have to actually basically dig out the core of the building all the way down, just so that you can have a window, even if it's an interior facing window, for every single unit. And I think that code pretty much stands in most states across the US. So you can't convert the larger, you can convert some of the smaller office buildings, but that's where the occupancy actually is across the US. So there are not that many available. We are looking at also hotel conversions. So where some of the hotels have gone dark across the US, those are easier. There's plumbing available, you can combine units. And so, that's a more viable path to converting something to affordable than office is. And office just requires so much capital, and there's not enough subsidy there to make that project viable.
I think that's going to be the biggest limitation, is the prohibitive from a cost perspective. And if you think about what you're building here, you're trying to build affordable housing. And so usually from a feasibility analysis, if the cost is X, I'm raising rents Y, and I can probably make it work. And we've seen that. That's not novel. Actually, I was talking with a municipality around, hey, office conversions, actually, we've seen those a lot, going from an office to a market rate multifamily. But this conversation around, you have these empty offices, can they be converted to affordable? I think the practical of that needs a lot of discussion, because not only the configuration is limited, but the costs are also, high to do that.
The housing gap that you were talking about in terms of affordable housing is, in my mind, it's in the context of the bigger housing gap for all forms of housing. And According to a Dan Walters column from last year, he was quoting from a real estate broker who had done analysis of census growth. And in Texas, which is a fast growing state, this real estate broker estimated that they needed to produce 11 million housing units between 2010 and 2022 and only produced 22% of that. And that's a state that has lots of growth and is less regulatory than some other states. So I think that's interesting that the shortfall that's in the affordable housing realm is just a subset in my mind of the total picture. And then one other thing I think it might be interesting to note is here in Mendocino County, a Section 8 voucher for a studio or one bedroom, basically one person, would pay a little over $1,200 a month. So it's not exactly a low rent that the Section 8 voucher covers. And I don't know how that relates to other parts of the country, but I would assume it's even higher in LA or other places.
Trustee Shoemaker?
That better?
Yes.
Okay. So, do you invest in Nuveen, or do you invest in Nuveen's projects individually, like you have a choice of where you want to put it? And with competition like Blackstone, you just say you want it in housing, they put it there. And again, you say they manage it or don't manage it. And that's the difference with you.
Yeah, so there's two different pathways. So one is our balance sheet that TIAA, Nuveen is the asset manager, which is the asset manager and operator. TIAA is the owner. And so TIAA turns over its investment capacity to invest in the affordable housing strategy to Nuveen, and then Nuveen invests on behalf of TIAA.
Okay.
Then we have an open-end fund that then the owners of that would be all the investors in the fund. Strategy being the same, where those investors turn over discretion and investment direction to Nuveen, and then we manage and operate those assets on behalf of our clients that are in the fund, which can be a collection of clients, including TIAAs in the fund.
Okay, thank you. And then California's been pretty aggressive in trying to open up housing, I believe legislatively. Do you see companies like yours doing better here now, to come here?
It's tricky. So California is one of the states that's very progressive in how it thinks about housing and its ambitions around sustainability and wanting to establish new housing units. But it also has a lot of red tape. And so, we're talking to the mayors of San Francisco and Sacramento. We're at the state talking to Secretary Ma. It's a lot of good momentum, a lot of good conversation, and I think California is making some headway, but it depends on how much red tape you can cut through to how quick they can accelerate the establishment of new units.
Do you have a project unit number, like how many units per project you shoot for in your project?
Yeah, typically we shoot between 150 to 200 units of a single project. But not to say that we don't own projects with 50 units, right? Like we could actually be interested in a project that's 50 unit because we own 1,000 units in the neighborhood. And so we're adding and looking at it from a portfolio perspective. And so I think it's on an isolated basis on how we would look at something below the 150, but on a single investment, we typically would look at, a unit range between 150 to 200.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We are going to move on to our next item. And
Well, thank you.
Thank you for your time.
safe travels. Okay.
Yeah, it was very informative. Thank you for coming up.
Mr. Reveles, our next item, infrastructure update.
Trustees, you have before you the manager strategy highlight update memo, and just provides an oversight of what's been going on and some key characteristics similar to what we look at for real estate managers. So be happy to answer any questions. I think the one of the final slides that shows the other metrics, probably the most interesting, just a verification that funds are performing as we'd like to see, and they've both done quite well since we've invested in them.
It's also nice to see that JP Morgan reduced their fee by 5 basis points. Thank you.
Well, they haven't yet, but they do expect that that's going to happen. So yeah, that'll. Well, I estimate maybe 10 grand, 11 grand savings per year. Any other comments on the item?
Any public comment? Okay, moving on to 3C, monthly investment performance report.
Trustees, you have the monthly investment performance report in front of you. You can see the funds sitting about 741 million as of the end of August. We didn't do any rebalancing, but we pulled a little bit extra for cash as a result, probably a little bit more than we typically to be pulling as a result of year activity. I would also like to point out on pages 3 and 4, you can see some of the returns for the month and fiscal year to date. I would point out that the international year to date are outperforming the domestic at this point, and the fixed income, I don't know that trustees are necessarily aware of this, but there's been a massive bond rally over the last 2 months. And you can see that reflected here in the fiscal year-to-date bond return of 3.94%. As of yesterday, the last time I checked, both of our funds are above 6% for the year. So just basically in the last almost 3 months at this point. So that's a good thing to see. There's a little bit of a rotation going on where the correlations that we saw in the past 20 years between stocks and bonds is reasserting itself.
Any questions or discussions?
I have a comment, I guess, in light of the last presentation, an interest in housing bonds, what those look like.
We could certainly bring back a report on that if the board directs that.
I mean, would they fit within our policies around how we currently keep our bond percentage? If we targeted that too.
May I ask, just for clarification, are you talking something like a mortgage-backed securities fund?
If there's more than that, yeah. I mean, is there a broad range? Is there municipal issued housing bonds? Are there private mortgage-backed bonds?
There are all of those kinds. Yeah. There are different varieties. So we certainly could bring back some education and information on that if the board directs. I don't specifically have any, pertinent comments about that at this time. But there are multiple California debt funds that I'm aware of that are a combination of bonds and actual mortgage notes. So, we could consider looking at some of those. We could bring back information on that if the board would like.
One person interested. So.
Trustee Jardy?
So just on that point, maybe you could just clarify, maybe off the spot. So my understanding is when an individual invests in a municipal bond, stay in their own state, then they're going to be exempt personally paying income tax for the state and from the federal government. So I'm just trying to understand how that benefit would not accrue to a pension system because we're already tax exempt.
That's correct.
So I'm not trying to say there isn't a way to invest in real estate in California, or I'm just not sure if that's the vehicle to do it because of it's usually a smaller yield because you're getting that tax benefit as an individual, and I'm just not sure how a pension system gets, if it's not going to get the yield and it's already got the tax benefit, so how does a pension system benefit from an investment like that?
If I might jump in on this one, I will use an example from Fresno. Fresno had a desire to support the local housing market in Fresno County and that region in the Central Valley, and they partnered with RBC to develop a pipeline for funding that basically provided mortgage funding, and they then owned shares of mortgages that, as the fund was managed, RBC was required to reinvest some of those mortgage proceeds back into that local area in order to support housing in that area. That was a custom product for Fresno to address their needs, but it allowed them to get exposure to mortgage-backed securities in their local market alone. So there are options other than just municipal bond funds that can provide some exposure to housing securities, whether it's collateral-backed mortgage funds or other types of funding opportunities.
Thanks.
And it would be probably within a fund structure, not an individual bond necessarily.
Is there any further discussion on C? Moving on to management monitoring summary and criteria.
Trustees, this item is a follow-up to questions that Trustee Land either asked or alluded to a few meetings ago, and we brought back some additional information from Callan, but we neglected to go over those slides at the last quarterly update. So that's what this memo and these 2 pages from the Callan report are showing. It attempts to answer the questions: how do we know an investment is at risk of changing status, and what criteria does Callan use to determine the status? Like I explained in the memo, previously there was only sort of 3 colors that distinguished the status of any given monitor. And after discussions with the board, Callan felt that it would be best to add an additional color that shows a notable change, but that is less of a concerning change. So we have a new color blue that indicates there's some sort of significant change, but it's not necessarily a performance related or a cautionary status change. And so that's what the second page here of the handout shows. On the final page that shows specific monitoring criteria that Callan uses, as well as staff use. And these are the specific items that would be answering the question that Trustee Land had asked about. So it's not an exhaustive list, it's just an example of some of those specific items that you want to look at reviewing a fund.
Trustee Jardy?
So I realize this is Callan's document, it's not coming from MCERA staff. And my understanding is there is hopefully a more detailed analysis that's going to come from MCERA staff at a future meeting in terms of the watch list. But my feedback to Callan, and I hope MCERA staff would be making this feedback, is I think that their analysis is woefully inadequate. So, and just focusing on one of these funds, the Prudential Small Cap Value, it has underperformed the index by about 34% in terms of return over just under a 10-year period. So I don't see how you underperformed so much and you only get a blue, not a yellow or a red underperformance. So I know that's Callan's opinion. To me, it's not sufficient in what they're communicating with this bar chart. And, to me, that's an example of fund that, and we just renewed, we just kept Prudential back in our fund, and I was questioning at the time. But I don't understand why they can advocate an actively managed fund that has added more volatility to the portfolio than the index and has underperformed the index by such a large amount over such a long period of time. And all they ding it on performance is notable status, noteworthy item, but no concerns. And I don't see how a fund performing that badly compared to the index can get such a soft critique by Callan.
Well, and that would be a question or a comment for Callan to respond to. My guess would be what they would say with regard to that specific strategy is that no doubt pre-pandemic was that fund struggling to perform. If you look at the performance post-pandemic, specifically 21 to current time, you're going to find that the strategy is actually performing quite well. In 2021, there was a very large return, the #1 performer. In 2022, it was also the #1 performer. Now, those are sort of rough. 2022 was a rough year. But, I think from Callan's perspective, they would say, small cap value has been out of favor, let's say for the last decade, but it has really turned around since 2021 going forward. That's not necessarily to say the strategy is an amazing performing strategy, but that is what Callan would say is, well, if you look at that performance over the last few years, it's actually been pretty good.
So to clarify, this is a small cap value fund that is actively managed. The benchmark is the index of small cap value funds. And it has underperformed the index of small cap value funds by its performance was about 34% less in terms of growth than the index. So it's a substantial drop in return, total return over the analysis I had was just under 10-year period.
So if we look back at the August 2024 report, the report we just looked at, we can look at that fund on a 5-year basis, 12.23% net return versus a benchmark of 10.38%. So they've outperformed the benchmark. Now again, you can look at a longer period that includes less of the most recent really strong performance for the fund. And that number is going to be less. So if you look at the 10-year return, 7.12 versus the Russell 2000 value of 7.46. So in that instance, yes, it is definitely true that they haven't kept up with the benchmark. And really, I'm just speaking for, I think that's what Callan would say here. That the strategy has sort of bounced back, and I would guess without doing the analysis, it's most likely because of the value rotation that has happened since 2021. And so trustees can sort of make a determination on the monitoring criteria that they think is most important. But Callan does provide a few examples for your consideration. The final page there.
So is this stock for other clients?
Is it done for other clients?
That's this
Yeah.
right here.
Very similar, very similar. Now, other systems maybe have specific watch list criteria. They're sort of tied into this. But, the other systems that I've reviewed from Callan, Pennsylvania, and they definitely have. They actually have a chart like the first chart. They don't have a list like on the final page here.
You made a comment that they may have slightly different criteria. So we don't have a backup policy that puts people on the yellow or blue. We just let Callan do that.
We don't have a formal watch list criteria
Now-
or policy. That's correct.
With the hiring of you, somebody who's dedicated to this work, is that something we should consider or might consider?
Well, it is something we're considering. Right now, the plan is to bring some sort of education back before Callan brings the international portfolio strategy manager change discussion back in December. We think they're bringing that in December. And my intent is to provide a sizable education at the November meeting related to benchmarks, benchmarking, indexes, peer groups, passive versus active, and sort of roll that into, hopefully, the watch list discussion where the board can say, hey, we think we should have a specific policy and we think that there should be these 7 or 8 criteria, that would probably include a lot of this criteria on this final page here from Callan, frankly. But it could also include other things like, performance of a manager versus a peer group on a rolling 3 or 5 year basis, right? Lower than the median, or so there could be some other triggering criteria related to a specific policy. I'll tell you that in addition to looking at performance, one of the things that I prefer to look at are risk factors for the funds. And one of the benefits to looking at those is that it sort of shows you under the hood of some of the exposures that each fund are looking at. And I personally find that to be very valuable. That's not necessarily something that is on the monitoring criteria. That's just sort of something else that I consider to be of extreme value. The other thing that I personally think is really important is the actual strategy, the commitment to the strategy, the personnel, the changing of the personnel or the process. That's that's just as important as looking at straight risk return metrics. You want to know that the fund is supported by the company, and you want to make sure that the key decision makers within that strategy are staying consistent. That's part of the looking at the risk factors. So those are just some of my thoughts, and I do intend to bring some of those in a more fleshed out fashion when we have the discussion on benchmarking and indexes.
Right.
So, question, does MCRA staff in any way independently verify what Callan is saying the benchmark performance was? Because, for example, I thought I had just heard you say that Callan said that in the last 10 years, the benchmark for small cap value was 7.4, and our fund earned 7.2. Is that what you just said?
712.
7.1?
746 versus 712
Okay, so.
as of August.
Yeah, and the numbers I have I know it's not technically the benchmark, but the Vanguard index, which is going to be really close to the benchmark, that's an index, it earned roughly 8.2% return over the same period. And according to the same figures I had that this fund earned, again, it was slightly less than 10 years that I have to measure here, so the numbers are off a little bit, but it was correlating pretty similar to what you said. It showed in slightly less than 10 years, it gained 7.2, the fund we have, and it was 8.2 for the Vanguard fund, a full 1% difference. So I guess I would hope that when Callan says the index earns this, that we would also verify, well, what did the Vanguard index fund earn? Because it's a widely held index fund, because it sounds like they're using a benchmark that's less than the Vanguard index is earning.
So I don't know anything about that Vanguard index, and given that the number you're quoting is, 100 basis points higher, I mean, I'm skeptical of something there, right? It could be that the period is different, without knowing and looking at what you're talking about. I would guess the period is different. There's another thing to consider when you're talking about an index versus a passive index. There are differences between the two in terms of performance. So you can have, and this is something that we'll get into specifically at the November meeting, but oftentimes, depending on whatever fund you're looking at, if it's a mutual fund, if it's an ETF, it's a closed-end fund that's tracking something like that, there are going to be significant differences because of the process involved in creating the actual investment fund, whether the fund's passive or active. The fund manager has to make decisions related to what types of investments from the index they're going to have to actually buy. And so that can create differences. I don't know specifically about that Vanguard fund, in specific that you're talking about, so I really can't comment on it.
So it's simply the Vanguard Small Cap Value Fund. It's the institutional class, which means you have to have 5 million or more invested, and then you only pay 6 basis points. The same investment fund an individual could get for 7 or 8 basis points, but it's just the generic Vanguard Small Cap Index Fund, Small Cap Value Index Fund, and it is targeting the benchmark.
Well, and that's a whole nother discussion. We could talk about the tracking risk related to that. I don't know anything about that fund. I can't comment on it. What I will say, your original question, I think, was, are staff tracking the benchmarks? And the answer is basically yes. Now, I only review essentially ETFs related to the benchmark. Right? I don't personally have access to the Russell 2000 Value Index provided by Russell. So my visibility into the true return of any of these major indexes is very low, especially something like the Russell 2000 that has a lot of companies.
So you've told me that you have access to some material that I don't have access to, and I'm paying $200 a year, and I'm getting access to Morningstar. So
Yeah.
do you have access to
Morningstar doesn't have access to that stuff.
No, they have access to the performance of all mutual funds.
Morningstar has access to mutual funds, but what I'm saying is that mutual funds oftentimes purchase a subset of any index.
They're not the index.
So in the case of like the S&P 500, yes, the S&P is only 500 companies. Your mutual fund or your ETF for the S&P 500 has 500 companies. In the case of something like the Russell 2000, theoretically it's got 2,000 companies, but your ETFs and your mutual funds probably don't have 2,000 securities in them. They might have 1,400, they might have 1,500. They might have a concentrated portfolio depending on the strategy. My point is that they're not the same thing. So you can have a passive index that holds less securities than the index it's attempting to track.
And just because they're both operating in the small cap value space does not necessarily mean that they are considered equivalents or using the same benchmark. Now, the Vanguard product uses CRSP small cap value index that they judge their performance of their fund against. That CRSP fund has a very different composition than maybe the Russell 2000 value, which is what our product may be basing its structure on. So there are significant differences between the specific types of funds and how they operate within a particular space like small cap value, and there's significant differences in particular indexes that are used as benchmarks. Now, I'm not saying that you don't have valid comments regarding the performance of our small cap value fund over a long period of time. More recent performance has been good, but they're not they're all the same type of apple. You could have a crab apple versus a golden delicious. There's a lot of variety within that space, and you might be looking at things that aren't truly comparable in some regards, is all I'm saying.
Is there any public comment on investment matters?
There is no public comment.
Okay, thank you. I would like to take a break right now. We'll have a maybe 10-minute break and be back here by 10:40. Is that okay with everybody? Next is agenda item 6, Service Provider Evaluation Policy Draft, Director Rentschler.
Thank you, Chair Cavness. This item does relate to the board strategic plan as part of the Goal 3 Objective C to develop and implement processes to evaluate MSERA's business operations and service providers. The Board of Retirement Charter in Section J does say that the board will ensure that appropriate monitoring and reporting practices are established, and that the board will regularly monitor compliance with board policies and evaluation of its service providers. In the draft policy provided, and this is provided sort of as a first read for direction from the board regarding the level of delegation that the board wishes to make, the policy was drafted with the board having delegated most of the responsibility for the evaluation of service providers to MSERA management, with management reporting back to the board. But if the board wants a more active role in that, the policy can be amended to conform with the board's desires there. So there's 3 requests for direction at the top of the introductory memo. It has to do with the level of delegation of the responsibility of evaluating key service providers, the frequency that the board would like to have those evaluations completed, and addressing the question of how frequently do we want MSERA to actually have to issue RFP for services, and what flexibility would be provided within that guideline as far as the suggested frequency of RFPs. The policy makes a distinction between key service providers and core service providers. Key service providers are those specifically identified in the Board of Retirement Charter that the Board of Retirement is reserving authority to appoint and evaluate those providers. They include our actuarial firms, our financial auditor, legal counsel, investment consultant, custodial bank investment managers, and there might be a couple of others. Everybody else that MSERA hires is then considered a core service provider. Those are contracts that don't necessarily have to come to the board, whether it was a consultant like Problonsky Research who did our member service membership survey, or if it's the firm that we hired for the strategic plan process. those are more core. They don't have to come to the board. The ones that are key service providers are the ones where the board reserves rights to appoint those providers specifically. So if you have any questions on the draft policy or wish to make comments or provide direction on the 3 questions provided in the recommended action, I'm happy to address any questions you have at this point.
Trustee Jardy?
So obviously the consultant that I'm most concerned about is Callan, and I've just raised an example where they're providing this board and staff with a benchmark, and it appears that an obvious comparator, the Vanguard best-in-class index fund, seems to be outperforming what they are claiming the index earned, or the benchmark.
They're using different benchmarks when you're looking at what the index is, the CRSP versus the Russell 2000 value. So again, there are other reasons for that discrepancy that you're saying is the difference of the index.
But it's hard to believe it's over a 10-year period, more than 50 basis points. So it just seems to me that I just kind of curious. I mean, we see this outline, but what's kind of the process you're talking about, having an evaluation process for the board to give input? I mean, I would give them an F for what they've advised this board, but how would that work? Would it be on an annual basis?
And those are some of the questions for the board. How frequently do you want to review key providers or core providers? What kind of report do you want? Do you want to be heavily involved in that process? Or as far as the key service providers, because they are services that the board reserves for board action, any evaluation process would include a survey requesting input from trustees on their view of performance of those key service providers. We also may look at external information, like a comparison of cost of a particular provider to the average cost in the marketplace, so we can assess whether or not they're cost effective for the services that provider provides. Technical proficiency, those attributes may vary from provider to provider based on the type of service that they're providing. And this policy is very generic in that it just delegates much of that authority and the decision to decide what the appropriate measures are, whether it's a survey of the board and, survey of other clients or a technical measures that we're looking at. It doesn't specifically identify those per vendor. It leaves that discretion to MCERA management. But that could be something that is included in the policy based on specific key providers. Again, a lot of it is how involved does the board want to be in the process.
I guess my point is, I don't think as a board member I would have anything to comment on the custodial bank or our security lending managers, our direct commission brokers, our proxy voting advisors,
right.
Or even the auditors or actuarial firms. I mean, it's really the one point of reference I have where I have outside information which seems to contradict what we're hearing from Callan, or one of our advisors is the financial advisor. So that would, as a board member, I'm not hearing information presented to this board that contradicts Callan, but I, as a board member, can find that information readily available from credible sources. But as a board member, I'm not going to find credible sources that are going to necessarily contradict our custodial bank or et cetera.
Right. It is difficult because in some places that I've worked, the board was supposed to be highly involved in the evaluation of those key service providers, but you don't work directly with the custodial bank or have that much contact with the actuary, and those types of evaluation are really more better left to staff who engage with those folks on a regular basis and have an idea of how responsive they are to questions and the timeliness and the accuracy of their results. So that's why this is fairly light on board involvement, but certainly the one where the board does have the most contact is that investment consultant, because you're seeing them every quarter and you're getting reports from them every month, unlike the actuary who does work for us for the board's review only once a year. So we can vary it depending on the service provider, and the evaluation of our investment consultant would be involving the board to a higher level than any of those other service providers that you mentioned.
Romer?
So I want to respond shortly and quickly to some of the comments that were made regarding this. I think there is information in here regarding that the frequency of service provider evaluations shall be subject to the limitations of staff time and resources. And my main goal here is to not dip into the realm of paralysis by overanalysis. So I trust that you're going to evaluate these people in the frequency in which they need to be evaluated. I understand Trustee Jurdy's comments, and I believe the majority of the board members here have only served under the tutelage and guidance of Callan, myself included. And I also look historically back to the last 4 chairs that have served in this board, and I don't think any of those, to include Trustee Jurdy when he was the chair, have presented a motion or direction to staff to do another RFP or RFQ of our investment consultant. So I don't think it's fair to say that they would receive an F from me, in my personal opinion, and they're not here. I understand some of the concerns that have been raised about our investment consultants, and I'm not dismissing those. But there is currently a process to evaluate them, or even to go out to bid for competitive bids, and nobody has done that. So I don't think it's fair to, in retrospect, look and say that they get an F when there's been a process that's existed for years, for the entire time I've been on the board, that nobody has initiated to request other bids.
One item that I think is relevant, it may not be included in the policy, is that I think at a minimum, those service providers do need to have an evaluation of their performance done when their contract is coming up to an end and we're deciding whether we want to re-up with them and do an extension of an existing contract, or whether we want to RFP. But I don't think there's been any sort of formal evaluation of any service providers, core or key, that I've found in the records of MSERA. So it may have been on a less formal process, but this is a movement to make that process more formal, with a specific report to the board regarding the performance of both key and core service providers. And I would suggest that at a minimum, we would certainly want to look at that evaluation of services prior to an extension of a contract when the initial term, whether it be 3 or 5 years, is coming due.
Well, I'll just say, I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago, there was a board presentation that Callan presented to renew their contract. I think there may have been a second company under discussion.
There was an RFP, yes, but
And
I don't think that MSERA as a whole did an evaluation of, Callan's performance prior to the decision to open an RFP, or prior to a decision to extend their contract an additional year or 2 years, or whatever it might have been. I think that as practice, MSERA should be providing the board with an evaluation of our service providers before we decide whether or not to extend a contract and come to you with a recommendation. Now, I know during the pandemic, we, being staff, came to the board and said, right now, with the pandemic, with the voluntary correction project, we don't feel now is the time to RFP or replace our actuary or our auditors. And, that was special circumstance, let's say, but I would recommend that we incorporate an evaluation process as someone's contract is coming due, so the board can get some feedback on how that performance has been before we go into discussions about, do we extend a contract, do we do an RFP?
Yeah, just the only thing I would add is that it was a split vote by the board to keep. I did vote against renewing their contract, and the former executive director of MSERA had concerns about Callan because they accept funding from many of the mutual fund companies that they recommend. And it was a split vote. The majority of the board voted to continue with them. I think those are just among the concerns I have about Callan.
And of the top 10 or 12 investment consulting firms doing business in the U.S., if I recall correctly, 50 or 60% of them are similar to Callan in that they provide consulting services to both money managers and to pension plans and funds of that nature. So it is not unusual. In the industry, there are a series of checks and balances and internal controls that Callan uses to, minimize that potential for a conflict of interest. And I think that had been discussed at several past meetings. But Callan alone is not the only company that has that business model, and some of them are not as diligent as Callan in trying to keep that wall between the two arms of their business units, the ones that do client advisory services to pension plans and trust funds and whatnot, and the arm that does investment consulting for money managers. Again, it was addressed and discussed at a couple of past meetings. I understand you still have concerns regarding that. I'm saying that just eliminating Callan does not necessarily eliminate that concern.
Seems like we're getting farther from this purpose of this document. So I would ask that we return to focus on this document.
Sorry, thank you.
So, yeah, the agenda item is to adopt the policy as presented or give direction regarding the policy. Is there any discussion on the content of the policy?
Trustee
Madam
Cromer?
Chair, I'll say that I bind with the language in the proposed policy to delegate the responsibility to the executive director. I don't personally have an interest in doing that research, nor the time or ambition to do that, or probably the expertise to understand what I'm evaluating. I don't personally want to specify the occurrence of those evaluations because I believe it is very contingent on time, staff, and availability. And if we put it in writing, I think we're setting ourselves up for failure. And I do understand and respect the importance of evaluating these people, and I do agree that our investment managers are very important and may have a more formalized process through the executive director to evaluate that more frequently, and the process also to go out to RFP or RFQ to make sure we are being competitive and understanding all options that exist. I understand that has not happened for a very long time because most of us on this board were not around for the last vote, which was a split vote for Trustee Jurdy. But it is the situation we're in, and I only have personally one minor grammatical correction myself, and that would be on page 3 of 4 of your actual draft policy, where notwithstanding anything contained herein, the board may initiate a review of a MSERA A service provider to strike the second A.
Thank you. My apologies.
And without any other feedback from my partners, I would make a motion to approve the draft policy as presented with that minor change.
Is there a second? Is there any further discussion on the motion? May we have a roll call? Yes, excuse me. Public comment on the motion?
There is no public comment.
May we have a roll call?
Yes. Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Ms. Cavaness?
Yes?
Mr. Jurdy?
Yes.
Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Mr. Shoemaker? Mr. Land?
Aye.
Approved.
Okay. Moving on to item 7, administrative report, Executive Director Doris Rentschler.
Thank you, Chair Cavness. In this month's administrative report, there is a construction update. We did have our first change order that added about $12,000 in cost that related to signage requirements and vision panel requirements that, and a couple other things that had not been fully detailed in the architectural drawing. And then in addition, we had a water line break and also discovered that our backflow prevention assembly was not functioning correctly. So that cost includes some irrigation chases and removal and replacement of the failed backflow preventer and shutoff valve. So those items were not included, obviously, in the architectural drawings because we didn't know we were going to have a water main break and find that we had a bad shutoff valve, et cetera. Additionally, we were unaware that we needed to schedule special tests for like the soil compaction and concrete testing, and that had not been included in our original budget. That added at about $8,700. So to date, we're looking at roughly $21,000 in additional costs compared to the bid. We do have another concrete pour going in, I think it's next week. Is it next week, Judy? Which will require that we work off-site again. And we do appreciate the assistance of IT and the admin center over here allowing us conference room space to work when we can't have access to them, Sarah. But that next office closure will be next week, I believe, the week that includes September 23rd. Nora and Judy are going to the Pension Gold Teaming Conference. We've found that very beneficial in the past, and it is an opportunity for them to get some questions answered and get some one-on-one training on our Pension Gold system. The other item of note was just the Sackers legislative update. Assembly Bill 2284 was moved out of the legislature and is at the governor's desk for signature or action. And the Sackers organization has submitted a letter in opposition to that assembly bill, while the OSERS, Orange County Retirement System, has submitted a letter in support of that assembly bill to the governor. So that bill was an attempt to modify the definition of compensation earnable to define what it means when it uses the phrase like similarly situated grade or class. The assembly bill defined grade in this case, I believe. So that, and then there was the regular monthly legislative updates from Sackers. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions on those items.
Doris, what do you think is the practical effect of AB 2284 if it goes into effect?
I personally think the practical effect is limited, in part because the amendments added during this legislative session require that your Board of Supervisors actually adopt it to make it operable in your county. So if you don't like the definition, don't have your county adopt it. I did not see that it was particularly problematic even before it became an optional provision, but I don't know if Jeff has any thoughts on that as far as the impact to it, but I did not think the impact would be particularly large.
I think that's a good summary. It is unusual that the Sackers Ledge Committee, went in one direction and you have a system going in another. But my understanding from some conversations with Doris, and I don't understand some of the substance of how Mendocino County treats this definition, but I don't think it has much significance, at least in this county, the way other terms are defined. So you could probably find out from your HR folks, but it sounds like it wouldn't have much impact regardless of what the governor does.
Do we have any further discussion?
Madam Chair.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I've read some of it and looked at briefs, haven't read the entire bill, but I felt like we finally got clarity on the Alameda decision, and it seems like we're trying to muddy the water again. And I don't understand the ambition of that or the support of it, but if it does have that caveat, it has to be adopted by each county board of supervisors, then who cares? I think it's just, it's busy stuff that doesn't matter.
My takeaway from my reading of the bill that went to the governor is that the biggest item is that it defines that grade really as more than one employee that shares a similarity, whether it be work location or job duty or a variety of other factors, but that it must be more than one individual. And that to me was really the takeaway of the entire legislation, in my opinion. Now, I'm not a legal expert, but that was my read of it, is that it really required that you have more than one employee when you're defining a grade for the purposes of defining whether or not a particular piece of compensation is pensionable.
Thank you.
Do we have any other board member discussion on this item? I can't. Is there any public comment? Thank you. Is there any board member discussion? Trustees?
We have moved on to 8, and I had a few questions about Doris's attending that conference. I'll start with, Tyron presented the actuarial strategies for mature pension plans, and they mention in the slides, did they elaborate on what a stochastic analysis entailed for them?
I don't believe they did. Based on my recollection, I don't have my notes in front of me. There was discussion from the actuarial side about certain sustainability metrics and the actuarial matters that could affect what you use to judge whether or not your plan is sustainable as regard to its level of maturity. I don't have those materials in front of me. I do plan to bring something back to the board as far as a discussion of sustainability metrics and the maturity of the plan and some maybe long-term decisions that the board may want to look at as MSARA becomes more mature, and I can certainly address those comments and the metrics that were discussed at the conference as part of that I plan to bring, if my calendar, if I recall correctly, was going to be February of next year.
I figure that the stochastic analysis would have been memorable, so I trust your memory on that one. And then Connecticut gave a presentation which included various, how did they improve, and they stopped, of course, the early retirement incentives, or at least what else from that presentation, if at all, seemed to be memorable?
If I recall correctly, Connecticut state legislature actually passed a law that said if certain revenues exceeded a threshold, anything in excess of that let's call it expected tax revenue base, was automatically redirected to fund the pension system without further action of the state legislature. That was very significant. I'm not sure if it will remain that way, because I'm sure at some point the state legislature would like to be able to redirect those funds, but they did have a rather significant underfunding, if I recall, from the case study, and that certainly, with some other changes they made, has improved their funding and their footing, the status of their plan. As they continue to improve the footing of the plan, I would expect that, you know, their state legislature might go back and modify that so they get to decide how those revenues would be spent, because they'd become part of the general fund. But if I recall correctly, that was part, and a significant part, of how that pension plan kind of turned itself around, was that state legislature making that choice.
And then there was a presentation by the CalSTRS deputy actuary. Was there some memorable part of that presentation that struck you?
I'm going to say there was, but right now I don't remember what it was.
That's fine. I was just sort of curious.
I do have the slide decks, and I've been reviewing those primarily to look at the different metrics that systems were using to judge maturity and sustainability. And I'm fairly certain that the presentation from the CalSTRS actuary addressed some of those items from their perspective, and that would be part of that item that comes back in February.
Thank you for indulging me.
Okay, is there any other general board member discussion? So we're going to move into closed session for the following items. There is going to be a conference with labor negotiator, Director Rentschler, regarding negotiations with MSERA staff in the confidential unit pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.7.
And actually, right before we break to go to the closed session, I did want to mention that the Fall SACRS Conference is coming up in November. I believe we have several people attending, including Jeff, Trustee Land, and our investment officer, Robert Ravelas, and perhaps one other person, I don't recall. But that conference is coming up in November. Oh, I'm sorry, Trustee Swope. So that is an important opportunity. It's November 12th through the 15th. It is being held in Monterey.
Trustee? Okay.
So I think we can break for.
So before we go to closed session, I just have a question for county council, or for council. Does this board have the authority to go into closed session to discuss salaries and compensation for these employees are part of a larger bargaining group for the entire county?
We'll be discussing that in closed session.
So apparently it's your opinion that we have authority to discuss whether to discuss?
Well, sure, and actually it was reported in last month's administrative report that there was a recent decision in the Lacera case, the California Court of Appeal, and that is still good law, although I understand the County of Los Angeles has petitioned the California Supreme Court to hear the case, and I don't believe the California Supreme Court has yet decided whether it will take the case or not. But this decision held that retirement associations under the California Constitution have plenary authority, meaning absolute power. And you could read this decision as saying these retirement boards like yours and the 19 other systems have absolute control over salaries and classifications. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll go into closed session.
So I did have a chance to read the ruling since our last meeting.
I'm sorry?
I did have a chance to read the ruling since our last meeting, and the question I have, well, I can ask it in open session. It appeared that at least part of the narrative of the judge, the appellate court anyway, was that there was a pattern and practice in that county of the county board of supervisors administratively approving what had been recommended by the Cyril agency, and that it was, and I would interpret that as at least part of their rationale was that they did not have a practice of going to their HR department to look at job classifications within the county organization, that they had their own independent system, and the Board of Supervisors had routinely just ratified it until a certain point when they didn't. And in this county, my understanding is there has been a pattern and practice of employees in this bargaining group having their positions evaluated along with all other positions or comparable positions within the county, and that the Board of Supervisors has approved those classifications. So I'm not saying that that's a difference with a distinction or not, but it does appear to be at least part of the narrative as to why the appellate court made the case they made. There seems to be a difference in fact pattern between this county and that county.
So I think there's plenty of authority in that decision, but putting that decision aside, if you will, I think that given the relationship that MCERA has with its employees, even aside from the LaSera decision, I think it has the authority to meet in closed session to have some discussions on how it would like to proceed, if at all.
Okay, we're going into closed session.
On the closed with labor and correction, the executive.
Thank you. Okay. The board 52 6 and 24.